Today's text comes from the book of Numbers, chapter 13, verses 25 through 33. In your pew Bible, it is on page 115. At the end of 40 days, they returned from spying out the land. And they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the Israelites in the wilderness of Pagán at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told them, "We came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is the fruit. Yet the people who live in the land are strong, and the towns are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the land of Negeb. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live by the sea and along the Jordan." But Caleb quieted down the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." Then the men who had gone up with him said, "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we." So they brought the Israelites an unfavorable report of the land that they had spied out, saying, "The land that we have gone through as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw are of great size. There we saw Nephilim, the Amalekites come from Nephilim, and to ourselves we seemed like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." The word of the Lord. Here, we've been talking about the journey of Israel through the desert and to the promised land a few times over the last couple of months. We talked about them by the Red Sea. We talked about their lost hope right after they left Egypt. After 10 plagues, after finally being freed, after finally being able to walk away from Egypt and walk away from the difficult life, they were easy to be persuaded to complain. After seeing all that God had done, they stood by the Red Sea and said, "Why have you brought us here? Were there not enough graves in Egypt? Why have you brought us here to starve in the desert? Why have you brought us out here so that we can die alone, away from anything and everything?" They idealized Egypt, forgetting about the servitude and the slaves. They said, "At least we had food. At least we had shelter. At least we can have garlic to flavor the food." They remembered or idealized the very little things, forgetting about the 400 years of servitude and slavery. They idealized because they were struggling to get to the promised land. So here we are once again. God had guided them through the desert. God had guided them through the travels and the journey thus far. God provided food for them. God guided them as the light at night and as a pillar of cloud by day. God guided their walk, their journey, each step of the way. And yet here we are again, entering the promised land, getting ready to go in, and what do we see? Right before our text today, we see that as they went into the land was literally flowing with milk and honey, with clear water, with fruit that was huge. It says that they brought a grapevine or a grape bush. Is it a bush? What is it? Grapes? But just the cluster. And they didn't just grab the cluster and bring it. They were so big they had to put it over a stick, and 2 people carried it, one up front and one behind. They were almost like the size of apples, I would believe. It was a land so fertile, a land so grand, that when you planted food, when you planted seeds, they didn't just grow to normal size. They grew beyond the expectations. When it says that they showed them the fruit, they brought this huge cluster of grapes and said, this is what the land holds. And yet, these spies had a difficult time seeing beyond what was before them. The first people to get before, or the first spies to get before the people, were the negative Nellies. They tend to be the ones who are the squeaky wheels, those who are closest, those who are the loudest. They tend to be those who want the world to know that we can't do it. They're the first ones to say the land is flowing with milk and honey, but I was always taught that anything that comes before but is useless information. I love you, but you're a good person, but they automatically disavow what they just said beforehand by saying but. The land is flowing with milk and honey. The land gives fruit beyond compare. The land is amazing. It is truly the promised land, but there are people there. But they are fortified cities. But there's no way we can do it. But forget about what we just said before it. Negativity began to rule the day, to the point where when Caleb and Joshua tried to speak, they had to calm the people down. That means that they had aroused the people. The people were like, well, how can we do this? We can't go in. We can't do this. Why are you sending us in? You have to remember that these people were easily to complain. These are the same people who kept complaining over and over again. So somebody bringing a negative report automatically starts the complaining, automatically devolves into chaos. Automatically, whatever great things could have been are automatically dead. Caleb and Joshua bring the people back and say, okay, wait, let's calm down. Let's calm down. Because what we are doing, or what we are about to do, is not by our own strength. It's not by our own power. It's not by what we want or what we can do by ourselves. For we did not leave Egypt by ourselves. We did not get out of there. We did not cross the Red Sea by ourselves. We haven't been walking through the desert by ourselves. They remind them that someone had called them, someone had guided them, someone had given them. God had been with them each step of the way, even when they complained, even when they were negative, even when they were in disbelief. God was still walking by their side, before them and behind them. Caleb and Joshua reminded them that this was possible. It was possible because God. No other reason. God. This land was promised to us. This land was given to us. This land was God promised to each and every one of us, and even to our ancestors. They remind them of that. But do we see what the problem is? The problem is that they thought that they would get to the promised land and they'd just walk in and everything would be all right. Everything would be good because we're now in the promised land. But God did not do that. Now that they were in the promised land, now was the time for them to start working for the promised land. For many of us in our lives, the difficult part is that we want to get to the promised land already. We want to be there already. But you have to learn what you need to learn on the journey. The difficulty of 40 years in the desert taught them how to survive. You have to remember, these are a slave people who didn't know how to fight, defend, or hold armor. And yet 40 years in the desert had made them a well-organized place and people who can go in now and take the land that God had given them. They learned on the journey. They learned while they were in the desert. Caleb and Joshua knew that now they could take the promised land. Yes, because God, but also because of the journey. For many of us, we are on that journey. We walk that journey every day. And we're hoping to get to the destination, but I have to ask you, are you ready for the promised land? Have you learned the lessons that need to be learned in the desert on the journey to get to the promised land? The journey is where we learn. The journey is how we grow. The journey is where our skin becomes thick and ready to conquer what God has placed for us. And when we get to the promised land, when we get to where God is calling us, it's not going to be just walk in and everything is hunky-dory. We may have to work for it. We may have to push for it. We may have to use the lessons that we learned on the journey to get there and to do what God has called us to do. The promised land is not a time to be lazy and say, well, God has brought me here. Woohoo! But instead, it is God has brought me here. Now it's time to work at it. That's not easy to comprehend, is it? In fact, it's difficult because we feel like we went through the desert. We walked the journey. We struggled through the journey. And yet here finally we get to the promised land. And yet we are still working at it. The people walked for 40 years through the desert. The people journeyed through the desert for 40 years. And yet, when they got to the promised land, they were still more work to do. How do you feel about that? For many of us, we have been in this journey or on this journey for a long, long time. We feel like we've been through the fire and we've come to an age and a time where maybe we should take it easier because we've been doing this for so long. I'm sorry to tell you that there's still work that needs to be done. There's still things that need to be looked at. There's still work to be done within and around us. Because the spies who came in with the negative report, did you see what they said at the end? You see what they said at the end of our text. They said, the people in the land are giants, and we are like grasshoppers to them. We are like insects to them. When I read this and thinking about the journey and all that they had been through to this point, all the growth that they had done, yet when they get there, they still consider themselves less than. And I thought, isn't that appropriate? Because for many of us, we are what we think we are. We struggle. We think less of ourselves. We think ourselves less than. So guess what you are? You are less than. When you think of yourself as invisible, when you think of yourself as less than others, you are less because that is where you have placed yourself. If you consider yourself an insect, in the midst of a world of giant sneakers, then chances are you're going to get crushed one day by the sneakers and feet walking by. But when you consider yourself a child of God, when you remember that God has placed you on this journey, when you remember that all of the lessons that have been learned, that all of the things that have helped you to grow, that everything that you have been through has led to this point, then you realize that I cannot be an insect if God is the one who has called me here. I am a child of God, a person who God has called, a person who is more than what they seem because of God. Joseph and Caleb were trying to remind the people, we can make it because God is in our midst. And here I remind you today that if you think yourself less than, remember that God is the one who has called you here. God is the one who has placed you on the journey. God is the one who has been guiding and strengthening. God is the one who brought you to this point, to this place. And no matter what others may say or think, you are a lot more than a grasshopper. You are a lot more than less than. You are a lot more than others may believe you to be, because God has brought you here through the journey, through the desert, through the impossible, through the difficult moments. God can make the impossible possible because we are God's children, guided by God on this journey, listening to what God has to say and following. We know that these people in the fortified cities fall before the power of the people of God. So as we walk this journey together, as we walk our individual journeys, I ask you, are you looking at the world around you and saying, I am but a grasshopper in the midst of all these giants? Are you thinking of yourself as less than? Because you got to know that in the later chapters in Numbers, they come before a fortified city called Jericho that was impossible to get into. But yet God told them to walk around it for 7 days. And on the seventh day, they were to celebrate and worship God and blow the horns and sing and dance, and the walls came tumbling down. It's not about how big we are. It's about how great God is. It's not about our expertise. It's about God's inspiration within us. It is not about what we can or can't do. It's about knowing and being inspired by the one who has guided us on this journey. So on this day, as you look at your life, as you look at your journey, I want you to reflect, and if you consider yourself less than, if you consider yourself a grasshopper who might get stepped on and ended without even realizing, I want you to realize this. God has called you. God has inspired you. God has brought you to this point. And you may be a lot of things, but a grasshopper is not one of them. You may be a lot of things, but less than is not one of them. God has called you. You are a child of God. God has been with you on this journey. You are a person anointed by God. God has inspired you. So receive that spirit and that inspiration and walk this journey in a way that you know that even when there's a fortified city before you, God will bring those walls tumbling down. Amen.